Do you think you understand geography? Then get ready to question everything. The world is full of paradoxes that defy logic. Did you know that Australia has more camels than Egypt? Or that the coast of Norway, if stretched out, would circle the Earth twice? And that Maine, not Florida, is the closest American state to Africa? Geography has secrets that few people know about, and in this content you will discover curiosities that will make any teacher rethink their classes. Are you ready to expand your worldview? If there's one thing that defies common logic, it's the complexity of the Norwegian coastline. At first glance, it may look like any other stretch of coastline, but if it were stretched out in a straight line, it would circle the Earth twice. The reason for this is its countless indentations, deep fjords and islands that look like they were carved by hand. This means that, contrary to what we might imagine, measuring a coastline is not so simple. In fact, the more detailed the measurement, the greater its length, a true geographical paradox that fascinates scholars and enthusiasts. This phenomenon is a classic example of what mathematicians call the coastal paradox, where the measurement of a coastline depends on the scale used. Take a map and try to trace the coastline of Norway with a ruler. Now, use a smaller ruler to measure the smaller details. See? The more precise the measurement, the greater the length you will find. This is because the coastline is fractal, that is, a geometric shape that repeats itself at different scales. Curious, isn't it? This makes the Norwegian coastline one of the longest in the world, despite how small it may seem on the map. But don't think that this peculiarity is just a theoretical curiosity. Norway's rugged coastline has a real impact on people's lives. Navigating its waters requires special skills, and many coastal towns are only accessible by boat. What's more, this unique geography is a great place for tourism, with cruises that pass through majestic fjords and breathtaking landscapes. Imagine waking up in the morning and opening the window to a deep blue fjord surrounded by snow-capped mountains. If there's one place where geography shapes everyday life, it's Norway. And speaking of curious geography, there's one fact about the English language that might surprise you. If you think the United Kingdom is the great bastion of the English language, you're in for a surprise. Although it is the birthplace of the language, it is not the country with the largest number of English speakers. The Philippines, a former colony of the United States, has over 70 million speakers of the language, a number that surpasses the entire population of the United Kingdom, which is around 69 million. This is because English is one of the country's official languages and is widely used in education, business, and even in everyday life. It is common to see Filipinos switching between English and Tagalog in the same sentence, a fascinating linguistic phenomenon. The dominance of English in the Philippines is not only statistical, but also practical. The country has become a top destination for call centers and customer service, precisely because of its population's fluency in the language. Multinational companies prefer to hire Filipinos for positions that require communication in English, as their neutral accent and language skills make them highly valued professionals. In fact, if you've ever called a tech support line and heard a clear, articulate voice on the other end of the line, there's a good chance you're speaking to someone from the Philippines. And here's an interesting fact. Many Filipinos speak English better than some native speakers in the UK. While the UK has such closed dialects that even Brits from other regions have trouble understanding them, the Philippines uses a more standardized approach to teaching English. This means that the average Filipino can express themselves more clearly than someone who grew up speaking a strong regional British accent. But if you find this connection between two distant countries surprising, just wait until you find out how you can travel from Pyongyang to Oslo by crossing just one country. If you've ever wondered how you could travel from Pyongyang, North Korea, to Oslo, Norway, without having to cross several countries, the answer is surprising. You only need to cross one territory, the vast Russian Federation. This geographical peculiarity is due to the fact that Russia shares borders with both North Korea and Norway, creating a direct route that connects two countries that are extremely distant, both culturally and politically. The distance between the two cities is enormous, exceeding 6,500 kilometers, and crossing Russia from one end to the other is no easy feat. The country, which stretches from Europe to the Pacific, is home to the legendary Trans-Siberian Railway, one of the longest rail routes in the world. Theoretically, one could board a train at the border with North Korea and travel thousands of kilometers to the border with Norway. It would be an epic journey, full of icy landscapes, historic cities, and time zones that accumulate along the way. But this isn't just a fun fact. it reveals the vastness and influence of Russia in global geopolitics. Few countries have the privilege or the challenge of connecting such disparate corners of the world. While North Korea is isolated and tightly controlled, Norway is one of the most developed and democratic countries on the planet. And in the middle of it all is Russia, a country that has always played a central role in world history. But speaking of surprising geography, there's one fact about the United States that few people realize. Which American state is closest to Africa? If you were asked which U.S. state is closest to Africa, most people would answer without hesitation, Florida. After all, it is the most obvious point of reference, with its tropical beaches and location in the extreme southeast of the country. But the correct answer is another, and much more surprising, one. The closest U.S. state to the African continent is actually Maine. Yes, that state in the northeast of the United States, known for its cold climate and delicious lobsters. The explanation for this curious fact lies in the curvature of the Earth and the exact position of the continents. The city of Quoddy Head, Maine, is the closest point in the U.S. to Africa, located about 5,000 kilometers off the coast of Morocco. Meanwhile, Miami, Florida, which seems closer, is actually a greater distance from the African continent. This type of misperception occurs because when we look at a flat map, we do not take into account the true spherical shape of the planet, which can generate interesting distortions. But this isn't just a geographical curiosity, it can be a good reminder of how our instincts aren't always reliable. Just as we automatically assume that Florida is closer to Africa, how many other things in our everyday lives do we take for granted? Geography can teach us a lot about perception and reality. And while we're on the subject of weather and unexpected places, did you know that in the UK a heat wave is declared with temperatures that many Brazilians would consider mild? If you think temperatures need to exceed 35 degrees Celsius to be considered a heat wave, then the UK may surprise you. In the country, a heat wave is officially declared when the thermometers reach just 25 degrees Celsius for 3 consecutive days. For those accustomed to the scorching summers of Brazil or the Middle East, this number may seem like a joke. But in the British context, where the climate is mostly cold and humid, 25 degrees Celsius is enough to make the English run to the parks, take off their shirts and declare that the heat is unbearable. The reason for this seemingly low threshold has to do with the country's infrastructure and the population's adaptation to the climate. In the UK, many homes do not have air conditioning, as the cold dominates much of the year. When there is a sequence of hot days, buildings retain heat and the thermal sensation becomes even worse. In addition, humidity can amplify the sensation of heat, making 25 degrees Celsius more uncomfortable than one might imagine. For a Brit accustomed to temperatures that rarely exceed 15 degrees Celsius, these days of extreme heat can be really hard to bear. And the impact goes beyond discomfort. Public health is also affected by these mild heat waves by tropical standards. As the British body is not accustomed to such temperatures, there is an increase in cases of dehydration and heat stroke. The government even issues warnings for people to take precautions, such as drinking more water and avoiding excessive sun exposure. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, much higher temperatures are treated as routine. But speaking of cultural and linguistic contrasts, did you know that Brazil is home to more native German speakers than some European countries? It may seem unlikely, but Brazil has more native German speakers than entire European countries, such as Belgium, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein combined. This is due to the strong German immigration that began in the 19th century and spread mainly through the south of the country. Cities such as Blumenau, SC, and Nova Petropolis, RS, preserve not only the language, but also the traditions, cuisine, and even German architecture. In some of these regions, German is spoken in everyday life as if it were the official language, something that few Brazilians outside this reality imagine. The German influence in Brazil is so strong that some communities speak dialects that not even modern Germans would easily understand. One example is Hunsrückisch, a dialect derived from German spoken in the 19th century that mixed with Portuguese over the years. If a German from Berlin arrived in one of these cities and tried to speak to the older residents, it would probably take some time to adapt. This linguistic phenomenon is a true cultural treasure and shows how immigration can create unique realities around the world. In addition to the language, German culture in Brazil is evident in famous festivals, such as the Oktoberfest in Blumenau, one of the largest in the world outside of Germany. Even traditions such as colonial coffee and the passion for craft beers were inherited from this influence. In other words, even if you never realized it, the German presence in Brazil is much stronger than you imagine. But if you think it's impressive to find Germans in tropical lands, wait until you learn that Australia has more camels than Egypt. When you think of camels, you might think of the vast deserts of the Middle East or the pyramids of Egypt. But surprisingly, Australia has more camels than Egypt itself. There are an estimated 300,000 wild camels roaming the arid Australian outback, while in Egypt the population of these animals is smaller and generally domesticated. This is because camels were introduced to Australia in the 19th century to help explore the desert, but once they were no longer needed, they were abandoned and allowed to multiply unchecked. Today, these camels form one of the largest wild populations of the species in the world. They have adapted perfectly to the dry environment of the Australian outback and have become so numerous that they are considered a pest in some areas. They compete with livestock for water, raid communities for resources, and can cause damage to the environment. The problem is so serious that the Australian government has implemented population control programs, including exporting camels to countries in the Middle East, where they are valued for their hardiness and meat. This is a fascinating example of how nature finds unexpected ways to adapt and thrive. Who would have thought that Australia, famous for its kangaroos and koalas, would also be home to one of the largest wild camel habitats in the world? Geography and history are full of these unexpected curiosities that defy common sense and show us how much more interconnected the world is than we imagine. And speaking of surprising facts, there are many more geographical curiosities to explore that no one tells you about. So, how many of these geographical curiosities caught you by surprise? The world is full of details that go unnoticed, and understanding these peculiarities is not just fun, it's seeing reality in more depth. Is what you've always believed about geography, and even other areas of life, really true? Or is it worth questioning more, exploring beyond the obvious and discovering what few people know? Now that you have this information in hand, how about sharing it with someone and testing your friend's geographical knowledge? I bet a lot of people will get it wrong when it comes to saying which American state is closest to Africa or where there are more German speakers than in certain European countries. And if you want to continue learning facts that defy common sense, you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and come discover the world in a way that no one teaches you in school.